The silence that followed the last chord was more deafening than any applause Marina had ever received in her life. She stood motionless before the grand piano, her hands still trembling over the ivory keys, as 50 pairs of eyes stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. The auditorium of the National Conservatory, which just minutes before had buzzed with whispers of disdain and muffled laughter, now breathed in unison, as if everyone had witnessed something impossible. Marina Stevens, the 42-year-old cleaner who polished those same keys every morning, had just played Chopin with a technique that would make centenarian masters weep with emotion. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back in time, to when it all began with a humiliation that still burned in her soul like hot iron. 3 hours earlier, Marina was sweeping the conservatory corridors when she heard the grave, authoritative voice of director Arthur Peterson echoing through the half-open door of his office. She didn't usually listen to other people's conversations, but her own name being pronounced with disdain made her stop, the broom frozen in her calloused hands. Marina? That woman who cleans the pianos? The laughter that followed was cruel, cutting. "Dr. Thompson, you can't be serious. She can barely read, let alone play a Chopin piece at the year-end recital. It would be a disrespect to our students, to the teachers, to the entire tradition of this institution." Marina felt the blood drain from her face. 3 weeks ago, she had timidly approached Professor Thompson, a kind, gray-haired man who always greeted her with a respectful nod. One quiet afternoon, when all the students had left, she confessed her most secret dream: to play the piano again. The professor, intrigued, asked to hear her play, and Marina, with trembling hands, performed a few passages from a sonata she had kept in her memory since childhood. She knocked 3 times, hard. "Come in," said Arthur Peterson's authoritative voice. Marina opened the door and found the 2 men sitting in leather armchairs, a steaming cup of coffee on the table between them. The director looked at her with irritation, as if she were an unwanted interruption. "Marina, we're in an important meeting," he said, without standing up. "If there's a problem with the cleaning, we can resolve it later. I want to play at the recital," Marina said, her voice coming out stronger than she expected. The silence that followed was tense, heavy. Arthur Peterson frowned, his face contorting into an expression of disbelief. "I apologize, but you must be mistaken. The recital is for students and teachers, not for," he paused, searching for words, "not for staff." "I can play," Marina insisted, feeling her heart pound. Arthur stood up abruptly, his face reddening. "This is ridiculous. You can't just come in here and demand a place in our most important recital. There are standards to uphold, traditions to respect." "What traditions?" Marina took a step forward, and something inside her, something that had been sleeping for decades, began to awaken. "Marina," Professor Thompson began, but she interrupted him. "No, Professor, let me speak." She turned to Arthur, and her eyes shone with a determination he had never seen before. "I've cleaned these pianos for 20 years. I know every key, every pedal, every note that echoes through these walls. I grew up listening to music, breathing music, dreaming music. And you think I don't have the right to play because I wear a blue apron instead of a tuxedo?" Arthur opened his mouth to reply, but Marina continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "My grandmother taught me that music is the language of the soul. It doesn't matter if you were born in a mansion or a favela, if you studied in expensive schools or learned on your own. When music calls you, you can't pretend you don't hear it." "That's very poetic," Arthur said, his voice dripping sarcasm, "but this is a serious conservatory, not a television show where miracles happen." Marina felt something break inside her. It wasn't just the dream of playing at the recital, but something deeper, older. It was the 7-year-old girl who had to sell the piano, the teenager who could never study music, the woman who spent decades cleaning the instruments her heart longed to play. "Then give me a chance," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Let me play now, here, for you. If I can't, I promise I'll never mention it again." Arthur looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You want to play? Now?" "Yes." Professor Thompson slowly stood up. "Arthur, I think that—" "No," Arthur interrupted him, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "You know what? Let's do this. Let's go to the main auditorium. Let's call some teachers and students. Let's give Marina her chance to shine." Marina felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Arthur was preparing a public humiliation, a way to show everyone why people like her should settle for a broom instead of dreaming of keys. "Perfect," she replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. 15 minutes later, the main auditorium was partially filled. Arthur had spread the news throughout the institution like wildfire. The cleaner was going to try to play at the recital. Teachers, students, and staff crowded into the seats, some curious, others clearly expecting a horror show. Marina walked to the stage, her steps echoing in the silence heavy with expectation. The Steinway grand piano awaited her in the center, its keys gleaming under the stage lights. She approached slowly, her hands trembling slightly. When she sat on the bench, she adjusted the height with the automatic movements of someone who had done it thousands of times. "So, Marina," said Arthur, his voice amplified by the microphone, "what piece will you present to us?" Marina closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of all eyes on her. When she opened them again, her voice came out clear and firm. "Ballade Number 1 in G minor by Chopin." A murmur ran through the audience. The ballade was one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, requiring not only impeccable technique, but also an emotional depth that few could achieve. Arthur smiled maliciously. "Ah, Chopin, what an ambitious choice." Marina didn't answer. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and for a moment the world disappeared. She was no longer in the auditorium filled with people waiting for her to fail. She was in her grandmother's house, at 7 years old, discovering for the first time that her hands could create beauty. The first chord sounded like a whisker, delicate and melancholic. Marina began to play, and immediately something magical happened. It wasn't just music coming from the piano, but an intimate conversation between her soul and the instrument. Every note carried the weight of 20 years of silence, of postponed dreams, of a passion that never completely died. The audience, which had started out noisy and skeptical, gradually fell silent. The whispered conversation ceased, the nervous laughter dissipated. Even Arthur, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a superior smile, began to frown, as if he couldn't believe what his ears were hearing. Marina played with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. Her hands danced over the keys with a grace that contrasted with the simple appearance of her work clothes. She wasn't just performing the notes, she was telling a story. The story of a girl who loved music, of a woman who lost her dreams, of a soul that refused to give up. Chopin's Ballade is an emotional roller coaster, alternating between moments of intimate tenderness and explosions of overwhelming passion. Marina navigated these changes with a sensitivity that left the audience breathless. When she reached the most dramatic section of the piece, her hands flew over the keys with a precision that would make any professional concert pianist envious. A young student in the front row began to cry, touched by the emotional intensity of the performance. A veteran professor who had dedicated his entire life to music whispered to his colleague beside him, "I've never heard Chopin played like this." Arthur, who had unconsciously approached the stage, felt something strange happening in his chest. Marina's music was breaking down all the barriers he had built over the years, all the preconceived ideas about who deserved to play and who didn't, about what kind of person could be called a musician. Marina reached the climax of the piece, where Chopin demands that the pianist pour their complete soul onto the keys. Her hands moved with an almost violent intensity, drawing sounds from the piano that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Tears streamed down her face, but she kept playing, lost in a catharsis of decades of repressed feelings. And then, gradually, the music calmed down, returning to the gentle melancholy of the beginning. Marina played the last chords with a delicacy that broke the hearts of everyone in the audience. When the last note dissipated in the air, she remained motionless, her hands still on the keys, as if she didn't want to break the spell she had created. The silence that followed was sacred. For long seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. It was as if everyone had been transported to a place where pure beauty existed, where there were no judgments or prejudices, just the naked truth of music. Then, slowly, Professor Thompson stood up and began to applaud. Then the young student who had cried did the same. One by one, the entire audience rose, and the auditorium erupted in a standing ovation that lasted a full 5 minutes. Marina opened her eyes and saw transformed faces around her. There was no more scorn, no more disdain. There was only admiration, respect, and something she hadn't seen in a long time: recognition. Arthur remained standing, his face pale, his arms hanging at his sides. He had witnessed something that challenged everything he believed about music, about talent, about who deserved to be on that stage. Marina slowly stood up, her legs still trembling. She looked at the audience, at the teachers and students who were applauding her, and felt something she hadn't felt in decades: pride. Not arrogant pride, but the quiet pride of someone who had found her true voice. Arthur began to speak, but his voice failed him. He tried again, clearing his throat. I've, I've never, I've never heard anything like it. Marina stepped down from the stage and walked over to him. For a moment, the two looked at each other in silence, and she saw something in his eyes she didn't expect: shame. Not the shame of having been defeated, but the shame of realizing that he had spent his entire life looking in the wrong place. "Mr. Peterson," Marina said, her voice soft but firm, "I don't want your place in the recital out of pity or obligation. I want it because I deserve it, because the music that lives inside me is as valid as any other." Arthur nodded slowly, as if each movement of his head was an admission of guilt. You, you will play at the recital. It will be an honor to have you with us. You know, sometimes life puts us in front of moments that make us rethink everything. Moments that show us that dreams have no expiration date, that talent knows no social class, that true music springs from the heart, not from the diploma hanging on the wall. If this story touched you, if it made you remember some dormant dream, then perhaps it's time to awaken. And if you want to follow more stories like this, which remind us of the beauty that exists in every human being, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because, like Marina, we all have a unique song to share with the world. In the weeks that followed, Marina's story spread throughout the city like ripples on a lake. Local newspapers published articles about the cleaner who conquered the conservatory. Radio stations invited her for interviews. Ordinary people who had abandoned their dreams began to look for ways to rediscover their passions. But for Marina, what mattered most was what happened every afternoon, when the conservatory emptied and she sat at the piano to practice. The director had offered her a private rehearsal room, and she had accepted on the condition that she would continue working as a cleaner in the morning. "Music completes me," she explained to Professor Thompson, "but cleaning these corridors keeps me connected to who I am. I don't want to forget where I came from." The professor smiled, recognizing in her answer the wisdom of someone who had learned that true greatness is not in elevating oneself above others, but in elevating others along with oneself. On the day of the recital, Marina arrived early at the conservatory. She had chosen a simple navy blue dress, which she had bought with her savings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, and that was enough. The auditorium was packed. In addition to the usual audience, there were people who had never set foot in a conservatory. Employees from other companies, housewives, workers who had finished their shifts and rushed to arrive on time. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had proven that dreams have no expiration date. Marina was the last to perform. When her name was announced, the audience erupted in applause before she even played a note. She walked to the piano with the same serenity she had shown on that transformative afternoon weeks earlier. This time, she had chosen Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, a piece that required not only technique, but also courage to venture into unexplored musical territories. She sat down, adjusted the bench height, and placed her hands on the keys. "This piece," she said into the microphone, "is for my grandmother Clara, who taught me that music is the language of the soul, and for all the people who have a dormant dream in their hearts, it's never too late to wake up." What followed was a performance that would be etched in the memory of everyone present. Marina played with a passion that transformed not only the music, but the very concept of what it means to be a musician. She wasn't just playing notes on a page, she was telling the story of a lifetime, of generations of dreams, of love that transcends time and circumstances. When the last note dissipated in the air, the silence that followed was different from any other. It was the silence of people who had witnessed something sacred, something that would change their lives forever. Arthur Peterson, watching from the front row, felt tears stream down his face. He had spent decades building walls, creating divisions, deciding who deserved to be inside and who should stay outside. Marina had torn down all those walls with the simple force of her truth. After the performance, when the crowd finally dispersed, Marina remained on stage, sitting at the piano. Professor Thompson approached and sat beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. Marina smiled, gently running her fingers over the keys. "Complete," she replied. "For the first time in 20 years, I feel complete. And now, what will you do?" Marina looked at the empty auditorium, where hours earlier hundreds of people had been touched by the music. "Now I will continue doing what I have always done, cleaning these corridors and taking care of these instruments. But I will also play. I will teach anyone who wants to learn. I will show other people that it is possible to find beauty everywhere, even in the most forgotten corners of life." 3 months later, Marina had become a legend at the conservatory. Students who previously hadn't even noticed her now sought her out for advice, not just about music, but about life. She had started giving free weekend lessons to underprivileged children, planting in small hearts the same seeds her grandmother had planted in hers. Arthur Peterson, transformed by the experience, had created a full scholarship program for emerging talents, regardless of their social background. He had learned that true excellence does not come from privilege, but from passion. And Marina? Marina continued to arrive early every morning, wearing her blue apron, cleaning the corridors she knew like the back of her hand. But now, when she passed the pianos, she sometimes stopped and played a few notes, just to remind herself and anyone listening that music is everywhere, waiting to be discovered. Marina's story taught everyone who witnessed it a fundamental lesson. It doesn't matter where you were born, what job you do, or how old you are. If music lives in your heart, if passion pulsates in your veins, then you have the right to dream, to fight, to shine. Because in the end, true music is not in the diplomas hanging on the wall, nor in elegant tuxedos, nor on the illuminated stages. True music is in the courage of a woman who refused to let her dreams die, in the persistence of someone who believed in herself when the whole world doubted, in the beauty that emerges when we finally find our authentic voice. And as Marina continued her dual journey, cleaning in the morning and playing in the afternoon, she carried with her the certainty that she had found her place in the world. It wasn't just on stage, it wasn't just in the cleaning room. It was anywhere she could use her hands to create beauty, where she could use her story to inspire others, where she could use her music to remind the world that we all have a unique song to sing. The silence that followed the last chord on that first transformative afternoon had been just the beginning. It was the silence that precedes the birth of something new, the pause that allows truth to settle, the sacred moment where dreams finally find their voice. And that voice, Marina's voice, would continue to echo through the conservatory corridors, through the hearts of those who heard her, through the stories yet to come. Because when someone is courageous enough to be true, when someone refuses to let circumstances define their limits, when someone chooses to shine despite the darkness, all of humanity becomes a little brighter. Marina had learned that she didn't have to choose between cleaning and playing, between being ordinary and being extraordinary. She could be all of it at once, because greatness is not abandoning who we are, but about fully embracing our truth with all its contradictions and complexities. And so, as the sun set over the city, Marina put her blue apron away in the closet, sat down at the piano, and let the music flow from her hands like water from an inexhaustible spring, because she had discovered that some silences are more eloquent than any words, that some dreams are stronger than any obstacle, and that some songs are so true that they can transform not only those who play them, but everyone who is lucky enough to hear them. The conservatory would never be the same. Marina had proven that music belongs to everyone, that talent knows no boundaries, that beauty can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that, sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to play their truth for the whole world to stop and listen. Because in the end, it doesn't matter if you clean pianos or play in concert halls, if you wear a blue apron or an elegant tuxedo. What matters is if you have music in your heart and enough courage to let it out. And Marina had proven that when that happens, the silence that follows is more powerful than any applause. It is the silence of transformation, of recognized truth, of beauty that has finally found its place in the world.